I'm going to give you a series of slides now that will underscore what I like to call principles of language learning and teaching, and which are explained in detail in Chapter 4 of this book, Teaching by Principles, that I've been referring to. So as I change this slide, I'm going to very quickly run through some of these principles, because my intent here with this lecture is to actually highlight 4 or 5 of the principles in some detail. But this particular page will give you an idea of the 12 different principles that I feel are extremely important in learning a second language. Now, automaticity I'm going to explain in this part 2 of my lecture, and so I won't say anything more about that. Meaningful learning is a very simple principle that says, let's make sure that in all of our lessons, all of our designs, that the material is relevant, the material is interesting, the material is challenging to learners so that they can have better long-term retention and better applicability to the real live world that's outside of their classroom. Meaningful learning, a tremendously important principle. The next, as I move up here on this slide, the next 2 I will be talking about as part 3 of my lecture in this tape, and I won't say anything more about anticipation of reward and intrinsic motivation right now. But I will go on to the next group of principles here just to show you the spectrum of possibilities in all these 12 principles. The next one that I would highlight, strategic investment, number 5. I'm going to try to zoom in on that a little bit. I'm also going to talk about, that's part 4 of this particular lecture, so I will leave that particular item uncommented on right now. But parts 6, 7, and 8, as I slide this paper up a little bit, parts 6, 7, and 8, or principles 6, 7, and 8, are a cluster of principles that I feel are extremely important. And if I had more time in this tape, I would give you lots and lots of thoughts about language ego, the extent to which our egos are involved in the process of getting this language out of our mouths and into our ears and communicating face to face, about self-confidence, the importance, utter extreme importance of self-confidence in learning a second language, and the absolute importance of risk-taking. And I will be talking a little bit about risk-taking and self-confidence and language ego in the process of talking to you at the end of this lecture in strategies-based instruction. Other principles that follow here as I slide this paper up are the language-culture connection. I think no one can deny that language and culture are intertwined, and it's an important element in communicative language teaching to keep some form of a cultural connection in mind, whether it's the culture of the USA or the UK, or whether it's the culture of Thailand or Japan or China, indigenous cultures. All cultures can apply in some way to the English language, and so the language-culture connection is an important one. My last 3 principles, as I change slides again here, are the native language effect. We all know about the native language effect. We're all quite familiar with the fact that our native language interferes with a new language that we're trying to learn, and it's certainly something to be accounted for in our teaching. The interlanguage principle I will also deal with in part 2, and communicative competence principle number 12, I've already talked about a little bit because it's kind of the summation of many of these principles, reminding us that in all of our efforts in language teaching, we should strive toward communication, toward real, live, unrehearsed language. So those are our 12 principles. And again, as I said, they're in chapter 4 of the book that I referred you to at the beginning, Teaching by Principles, and you might want to take a look at that chapter for a little more detail. I would say one way to think about these principles, because there are 12 of them, we could get overwhelmed. One way to think about it would be, what are the most important principles for you? And that's going to be a personal choice, and a choice that's dependent on your context, your experience, your students, and their purposes in learning the second language. Because I think all 12 can apply, but you may wish in your teaching to evaluate yourself or evaluate your teaching on the basis of a few of them, and maybe pick the most important. And in parts 2, 3, and 4 of my lecture here, I'm going to pick up on several of these principles and try to illustrate them for you to show that you can indeed use them for designing, for teaching, for evaluating your students. Let me, however, just close off this part with one example of using the principles, and I'm going to change my slide again here as I pull that off and put on this particular list. And I'm only going to give you really part of this list because it doesn't matter. I have a whole long list of techniques here. And so you're wondering, well, how do I use these principles to evaluate or inform techniques that I'm going to use in the classroom? Well, I've listed here very familiar activities and techniques that you use in the classroom: choral drill, jigsaw, interview, role plays, reading aloud, fill in a closed passage, scan a reading passage for details, explain grammar, give reading comprehension questions. And if you were to take these and a dozen or several dozen other principles, you might be able to take a look at the performance of one of these techniques and evaluate the success of that technique according to certain principles. And so if I were to take that same list and superimpose a list of a set of principles, and my lines didn't line up here, so my technology is still in need of improvement, but I think you'll get the idea. You can take a look at, say, choral drill and make a decision to evaluate the success of something or to determine the use of something in your classroom in accordance with a number of principles. And I've just chosen 3 here. So does the choral drill promote language ego? And in a way it does, because people can repeat things without feeling that they're on the spot and being singled out. Does it promote autonomy? And in some ways a little bit, but probably not very much autonomy, because it's just kind of repeating. But it could contribute a little bit to autonomy. Does it promote automaticity? And we'll be talking about that. And the answer is probably very much so. Does a jigsaw task where you're doing, say, a set of group work with a map or whatever, does that promote language ego? Maybe in the form of helping people to feel competent in the language. Does it promote autonomy? Perhaps so, in learning language that applies outside of the classroom so that when they're beyond the walls of the classroom, they can use language. Does it promote automaticity? Maybe and maybe not, depending on the situation. Now, one could go down through technique after technique after technique and string any number of principles along the side here to evaluate the success of the technique, either before you plan it or after you have used it in the classroom. So that's one example of a way to use principles to evaluate your performance as a teacher. As I close off this part, I want to call your attention to, and I'm going to move this slide here, I want to call your attention to some questions that I would hope you would be able to address as self-study questions in the process of thinking about language learning and teaching, thinking about the principles that I have just talked about, thinking about approaches. And so for part one, I've got 3 questions here for your contemplation on your own. Number 1, can you think of principles to add to the list of 12? And believe me, I've already put autonomy on that previous slide. That's not listed here, and I think that's a good principle. There are a number of possible principles that one would be able to add to this list and possibly subtract some. As a teacher, number 2, which 3 principles do you think are the most important for your context? And question 3, how have certain principles affected your own language learning? And you might want to do a little journal and go back to your own language learning and think, well, you know, how did intrinsic motivation drive me, or extrinsic? How is meaningful learning important? How did I achieve automaticity? So think about those 2 questions as self-study, self-contemplation possibilities.